Good evening and welcome to Reproaction's Act and Learn webinar for the month of October. We have a very important topic tonight, gun violence and reproductive oppression. So first we'll introduce your hosts. We are the co-founders and co-directors of Reproaction. The first voice you're hearing is myself, Erin Matson. I'm based in Arlington, Virginia. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm Erin to the max on Twitter.
And I am Pamela Merritt. I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm the other co-founder and co-director of Reproaction. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm at Sharpoo on Twitter. So our agenda for tonight is going to be a quick introduction of Reproaction for people who aren't familiar with the organization. And then I'm going to give a brief introduction of our topic, which is gun violence and reproductive oppression. After that, we'll have a panel discussion. Our panelists for tonight are Tishaura Jones, Treasurer of the City of St. Louis, Jessi Gold, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at WashU School of Medicine in St. Louis, Damen Alexander, who is an organizer with March for Our Lives St. Louis and is currently in the class of 2022 at St. Louis University, and Elise Saulsberry, who is Interfaith and Outreach Associate at Sister Reach. Once we're done with the panel discussion, we're going to go through some next steps in housekeeping, and then there will be time at the end for a Q&A. If you have questions throughout this call, simply drop your questions into the question tab, and I will get to as many as possible by the end of the call. The hashtag for tweeting tonight is Reproaction. So Reproaction is a new direct action group that formed to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are proud of our left flank analysis, of our willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, whether they identify as allies or opposition, and our commitment to nonviolent direct action. So in 2016, I wrote an op-ed that was published in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch explaining why a proposed gun law that would allow open carry in my home state of Missouri and remove most license and training requirements was a threat to my family, and very specifically to my older autistic brother. I lobbied hard against the proposed law because being able to hang out in public spaces is critical to my brother's quality of life. And also the fact that he is nonverbal and a Black man in a city that has a horrible track record of police violence against Black people made that even more clear and more important. 2 months prior to that bill being introduced and moving its way through the legislature, a caretaker of an adult with developmental disabilities named Charles Kinsey was shot by a police officer while trying to convince his client, an adult with autism, to come inside his house. Police later confirmed that the shot had been intended for the adult with autism. Next slide. The gun law passed despite vocal opposition from all corners of the state. Missouri is now one of the worst states for gun deaths, leading the nation in officer-involved shootings as well. This summer, 18 children didn't survive to see the first day of school. Because in Missouri, guns have more protection than people. The toll on our communities is high, and tonight we are going to explore gun violence as a reproductive justice issue. So it is my pleasure to introduce Tishaura Jones, who is the treasurer of the City of St. Louis, the first woman and first African-American woman in that position. Her office's investment strategy has yielded over $25 million for the city, and its College Kids program has helped 13,500 city kids save nearly $1 million for higher ed. Tishaura previously served as minority floor leader in the Missouri House of Representatives, and Tishaura Jones enjoys an active volunteer career as a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Her dedication to public service has earned her numerous accolades, including awards from the St. Louis Coalition for Human Rights and RCGA and the Lupus Foundation of America. Tishaura can be found on Twitter, keeping it real, at Tishaura. Welcome, Tishaura.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. So let's jump right in. I've got questions. So as I mentioned, the city of St. Louis has been devastated by gun violence, and children have increasingly been caught in the crossfire. On August 27th, you wrote an amazing op-ed that was published in the St. Louis American newspaper, which is this region's historic African-American paper, calling out St. Louis Mayor Lyda Krewson and her administration for failing to propose legitimate solutions to gun violence in our community. Tell us why you wrote that article.
I wrote it because I'm fed up, just like I think everybody that watches the news and has seen this summer that one is too many children being caught up in gun violence. And I watched the mayor's press conference, and she opened it saying that conventional policing tactics are not enough. And then she called for more of the same. She called for a $25,000 reward courtesy of billionaire conservative political donor Rex Sinquefield for information leading to the recent shootings that claimed the lives of our children. And the award had to be claimed within a week. Well, our children are worth more than that. And anybody who knows Rex Sinquefield, that you can't divorce, or philanthropy doesn't outweigh the misdeeds of wealthy benefactors. He has spent millions of dollars trying to eliminate our earnings tax, sell our airport to a private entity, and eviscerate Black leadership through the failed city-county merger scheme that was ironically called Better Together.
Thank you so much. So I would like to give you some time to talk about what policies, as a member of the community, as a parent raising a child in this city, and also as a public official, what are some of the policy solutions that you support?
Well, I believe that poverty first is the father of crime. If you solve for poverty, then you'll see crime decrease. So how do you do that? We decrease poverty by raising minimum wages to $15 or more for city workers and encouraging local businesses to do the same. We fully fund evidence-based violence prevention models for every neighborhood that has violent crime. We close the workhouse and invest that $16 million annual savings into prevention programs. We increase access to medical treatment for mental health and substance abuse. We support our schools and our education system, our St. Louis public schools and the charter schools that educate our children. And we invest in financial empowerment programs, including the College Kids Children's Savings Program and mortgage lending programs to help our communities invest in themselves. And we work hard to reduce the racial wealth gap.
Wow, that's amazing. And for people who are not familiar with the workhouse, could you just tell folks briefly what that horrible entity is?
Yeah, it's a rat hole. It's an old jail that should have been closed years ago, but instead it is still open, even though our jail population is small enough to put everybody in a city jail downtown. It's rat infested. It has mold. It doesn't have the proper ventilation and proper air conditioning in the summertime and heat in the winter. And it needs to be closed. But for some reason, our city officials refuse to close it.
Yes, and it should also be noted that a lot of people who are currently being kept in the workhouse, the only crime that they have is being poor. They can't afford to pay bail and get out.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
I said exactly.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Yes, exactly. It's very frustrating. So my final question is, a personal one, because you were my rep for many years, and I've known you for a long time. And I want to know, kind of as a Black woman and mother, how has gun violence impacted your life and the way you parent?
Yeah, so this is where it becomes personal for me, because I am the mother of the most adorable 12-year-old son. And when he was 9 years old, he was walking across the street to my father's house, which is just a block away. And a young man held him up at gunpoint to try to rob him, and he had nothing on him. Also, there was a time when he was playing outside, and some men drove up the street in a car and started shooting in the air. And one of those bullets could have easily hit my son, and he could have easily been one of the victims we lost. So, you know, it's personal to me because, like I said at the beginning of my remarks, one child lost to gun violence is too many. And I don't feel like there's an urgency from our city officials to tackle this problem. You know, we have 9 citywide elected officials, 28 aldermen, and yet we are not all coming to the table to discuss solutions. If this were a business and there was a problem in the industry where, you know, that would cause us to lose market share, the CEO would have all hands on deck and all people at the table. And I don't feel that urgency from some of my colleagues.
Thank you so much. Tishaura, are you going to be able to stay with us throughout the call, or do you need to go to another event?
Yeah, I gotta jump. I'm going to a neighborhood association meeting today. I'm making the rounds.
Yes, well, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much for adding your insights and your perspective and joining us for the time that you could for this call. And again, if you have questions, please. Thank you. If you have questions, please drop them into the question tab, and we will get to them at the end of the call. And thanks again, Treasurer Jeff.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm very pleased to introduce Jessi Gold, who is an MD, MS, and an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Washington University School of Medicine, where she works at the Habib Health and Wellness Center, teaches students, and sees patients in outpatient psychiatry. Dr. Gold obtained her medical degree from the Yale University School of Medicine in 2014. She completed her residency in psychiatry at Stanford University, where she served as chief resident and received numerous awards, including membership into Alpha Omega Alpha, the American Psychiatric Association Leadership Fellowship, and others. She also holds a master's degree in anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania, and you're encouraged to check out her writings on her website at www.drjessigold.com. Jessi, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
All right, well, let's dive right in. So my first question for you is, what are some of the ways that living in communities plagued by gun violence can impact a person psychologically?
Yeah, thanks for asking this question, and also for having this conversation at all and making sure that mental health was part of it. It's really appreciated. I think when we think about gun violence and how it affects a community, you have to think about how it not only affects the person, their family, the place that they live, but what that's doing kind of to the whole culture and society that we're talking about. So I think we don't know a lot about what gun violence does to people because we don't have a lot of research. So I'll start there, which is that there's an amendment in 1996 called the Dickey Amendment that says that the CDC funding for research can't go to gun violence prevention. And so because of that, we lack a lot of data, which I'm a science person, so data is very nice. So me answering this question is going to be almost entirely from kind of anecdotal experience and things that people tell me as patients. But I have patients that, their family member was directly affected, they were directly affected, or even have watched all of this kind of play out on TV. And all of them have, I would say, you can see symptoms of anxiety, which would be things like panic attacks, So if you hear a loud noise, you might think it's a gunshot. That might mean that you are scared to go places specifically. In today's day and age, that can be kind of anywhere. We've had mass shootings specifically in movie theaters, in religious areas, in schools. So a lot of the conversation around that is like, do you feel safe going back to school? Do you feel safe going into a movie theater? And people have those same kind of symptoms. So like increased heart rate, trouble breathing, kind of like unable to focus. That's all anxiety and panic. And then things like depression can also happen. So we've seen in some of the people who have survived episodes of gun violence or gun violence in the community that there'll be something called survivor guilt, which is like kind of this just like feeling of being like, why did I survive when other people didn't? And that can lead to depression, which can look like you're not eating, not getting out of bed, not sleeping well, or you're sleeping too much. You might not be interested in the things that you used to enjoy. So those are pretty common. And then I would add probably PTSD to that. So that term's thrown around a lot. I mean, post-traumatic stress disorder, we use it for a lot of things, but it's just basically like people who have reactions to witnessing or directly being related to some sort of trauma. That can look like the things I was talking about where you have an increased startle reflex. You could have like irritability. You could enter a room and really like scan the room more than an average person might have nightmares, flashbacks, which would be like during the day, kind of being put back into the place that you were experiencing all of that. So in my mind, all of those things can come from gun violence, and that can affect everybody. Like, I don't think we know enough to say whether if you watch all of this play out on television, all of that can be the same kind of aftermath, but I think we think that's true. And then I would just add lastly that kind of having this idea that gun violence is related to mental illness and that the people who perpetuate shootings are only mentally ill does lead to like a different psychological impact, which is that people who have mental illness are afraid to talk about having mental illness because they're afraid of being labeled violent. And that can mean that people aren't getting care when they need it. It can mean they're not talking to their family and friends about it. It could mean that they feel ostracized or, left out in some way from their community. All those things I think I would put under that question, which is a long-winded answer to say it's very, very complicated.
Thank you. And I would call it an incredibly comprehensive answer. And I just want to appreciate a number of things you said, including really calling attention to the fact that this is not just a psychological impact on people, but a sociological phenomenon that we live in now because of this country's absolute and utter failure to take common sense gun violence prevention measures. My next question for you is really personal to me as the parent of a 6-year-old daughter who started kindergarten last year and began doing monthly drills where they practice how to hide and avoid getting shot. And having a 5-year-old tell you about that is really quite jarring. So my question is, what impact does gun violence and the tension of constant preparedness have on children?
Yeah, I've actually heard a good number of stories about the increase in drills. And I mean, if you think about even just like fire drills, they cause an increase in anxiety. And that's just because you're doing something and then you have to pretend there's a fire, let alone like a mass shooter where in some of these cases, they actually have people pretend to shoot. So in those kind of drills, the danger is that you're triggering something that someone already is struggling with. So if they've been in a community with violence, and they do have some sort of traumatic reaction to that, they very well could be basically triggering a flashback. If they've never been exposed to gun violence, at least personally as a child, they might very well be traumatized by that event. We don't know enough research-wise to say whether that's true, but it makes sense that if you're acting out a scenario to kids that sometimes don't really understand real and make-believe yet, or even are still trying to work out right and wrong, it seems like it would be a dangerous thing to introduce into the conversation as something that they're always thinking about. We already have really high rates of depression and anxiety in younger children and teens, and that's only been going up, and our suicide rates in that population have only been going up. So I can imagine that if we start talking about this all the time for, 5 or 6 year olds, those rates are either going to get younger or just continue to still be higher. And that would be what I would say. I hope that people do think more about those things when they're talking about gun violence, and talking about how to help communities, because I do think that what it's doing to the community, even to prepare, is definitely neglected from the conversation.
Thank you for that. Yes, I have no words for my 5-year-old telling me, when she was 5, she's 6 now, telling me walking me through what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to be very quiet and you might be upset. And then she looked at me and she said, "You can take little breaths if it helps." And I just later that night lost it. So my next question to you is, and my last question before we move on to the next panelist. And folks, if you have questions for Dr. Gold, please put them in the chat box now or anytime. When people say gun violence is a public health issue, what do they mean?
Yeah, so when we talk about public health, we mean it affects a lot of people. So usually when we talk about things like that, we're talking about tobacco, we're talking about seatbelts, we're talking about vaccines. Those are all these big issues that are affecting a lot of people. Now, it's not just how many are affected, it's also that the numbers going up. You can look at trends for whether it's an epidemic, which most people would consider gun violence in this country to be. When we talk about it as a public health issue, it also allows us to approach it the same way we would approach other public health issues, which means thinking of really big, like systemic solutions for change. So something like putting in seatbelts or putting in airbags in cars really decreased the amount of people that were dying from car crashes, and that was a public health intervention. Or taxing cigarettes was a public health intervention. So when you think about public health and how to intervene in a gun violence way, there are things that people do talk about, like how do we make guns safer, or how do we not allow certain kinds of guns, or who can get the weapons. And those things are more like public health solutions. And I think those solutions then tend not to be based on, they tend to be as apolitical as possible, which is not easy in this particular arena, and tend to be less emotion heavy and more looking at the data, what's the best way to intervene, which therefore means we need data. So I'll just put a plug quickly for my friend runs a program called Affirm Research, which is actually trying to do the research on this, since they can't do it from the government level. And it's like a bunch of medical professionals and other organizations all together trying to collect the data so we have it, so then we can actually figure out what the best interventions are. But that's what they mean when they say public health.
Thank you. And just in closing, did you say it's Affirm Research?
Yes, Affirm Research, AFFIRM.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, if you have questions for Jessi, please put them in the questions, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. And I'm going to pass it back to Pamela.
Thank you so much, Erin. So it's my pleasure to introduce Damen Alexander. Damen is from St. Louis, Missouri, and is a sophomore at St. Louis University studying political science and African American studies with a concentration in public policy. Damen has worked at the grassroots level for many local candidates and causes in St. Louis and nonprofits, including Action St. Louis and We Power. Damen started gun violence activism after the Parkland massacre, but used the national media attention to shine a spotlight on everyday gun violence that happens in St. Louis, the deadliest city in America. Damen is a fan of Chance the Rapper and bike rides. You can find Damen on Twitter at 8Alex. Damen, welcome.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Of course we can.
Okay.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to jump right in with questions. So My first question is, how did you get involved in the March for Our Lives St. Louis?
Yeah, so the little bio here kind of talks about it a little bit there, but the Parkland massacre happened on Valentine's Day, my senior year of high school at SLU High. I had not really been involved in any type of organizing or planning events, etc., before that date. I had, of course, gone to protests in a few months prior with the Jason Stockley protest, which for people outside of St. Louis was an officer who was acquitted of murder acquitted of the murder of Anthony Lamar Smith in 2017. So that happened my senior year as well. I had seen Ferguson happen on TV. I was a little young then, really. I'm still only 19. And really, like I said, I had been working on campaigns before, and I kind of just got sucked into it as like a young activist that people were looking at and looking for to help organize the march. And again, I kind of talked about this in the bio a little bit, but Parkland is a very wealthy and white area, and I'm not trying to like belittle like a loss of life anywhere should be an outrage, but what we really tried to do with the St. Louis March for Our Lives was that we need to talk about how St. Louis is different. We need to talk about the 200 plus people that have been murdered and die in mass shootings every single day in St. Louis City streets. And we need to talk about how St. Louis PD kills more people than any other police department in the country. And we need to talk about the trans women that are being murdered every single day. So that was kind of the stuff that kind of went into the march. So yeah.
Thank you for that. So I know you spoke about this a little bit, your experience and of school violence and watching it happen in other communities, and then obviously watching gun violence happen in your home city. How has gun violence impacted you personally, and does it change how you navigate school or the world?
So I have not been directly impacted by gun violence, but like I think Aaron said at the top of the webinar, 18 kids have been killed in St. Louis this summer alone. And I think The Guardian was the newspaper or whatever you call it that put together and said, like, we lost a combined 818 years of life this summer. And then the Post-Dispatch had an article from earlier this summer that said 141 kids have been lost. 141 kids have been killed in the last 5 years in St. Louis. And when you see these things happening around you, I don't think you have to be directly impacted to be mad or pissed off about it. One of the kids that was killed, one of the 18 kids that was killed was Xavier Asunga. He was 7 years old the day before he started second grade. He was actually a camper in a camp that I was a counselor at last year. So in St. Louis, because of really the laws we have at the state level, because of generational poverty, if you are not directly impacted by gun violence, there's a very high chance that you know someone who is. And then the other part of the question was schools or something like that?
Yeah, does it change how you navigate school or navigate through your daily life?
Oh, absolutely. I think it was Erin again said at the top of the webinar about how her daughter was talking about mass shooter drills. And I think it was the New York Times who called, I guess, our generation 2 years ago the mass shooter generation. And I definitely remember doing those drills second grade. I have vivid memories of like hiding in like closet. I don't know if classrooms have closets anymore, but we had closets in our school, like hiding in closets and like closing the closet doors and like closing the blinds and stuff, and like people banging on the door. and that can be like really traumatic for, like, I don't know the scientific like stuff behind it, but I would imagine that could be really traumatic for especially young minds. I mean, even now I'm in college. I live on a campus. I still have thoughts like, what if like I really piss someone off today? Like they have a gun, they're in my dorm, and like they shoot my like lock off. Like what happened? Like those are the thoughts that you have, and like, is it a possibility? Yes, but like, is it a legitimate possibility? Like no one knows. So like, how like that's an impact that it has, and does it change how you navigate? I mean, absolutely. Like there have been like times when you're like in a classroom or a library, and you're like, okay, if X happens, what's the fastest way to like get out of here? Because like and it's really scary that like that's like our reality now, but that's the times we're living in.
My goodness. Thank you for sharing that. And my final question, Damen, is what advice do you have for young people who are interested in taking action or who feel called through an incident to take action?
Yeah. See, people always ask me this as like the young person in the room. And even, I mean, sometimes, Pamela, I mean, sometimes you're the only Black person in a room and they're like, oh, you're a Black person. How do we get other Black people here? But
it's true. It's true.
But I mean, really the answer is you just have to do it. Like I said, like I was kind of involved to a certain extent before March for Our Lives, kind of just like working on campaigns that kind of aligned with my values, and kind of just getting involved in any way possible. And then the post-March, that's kind of been accelerated. I've worked for a few nonprofits, etc. But you just have to do it, and whatever you're called to do, you have to get out there. It can be volunteering, phone banking, like literally anything helps the fight.
Damen, thank you so much for your activism. And if you'll hold on, we're going to have some Q&A at the end of the webinar, but I'm going to pass it to Erin right now.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Pamela and Damen. All right, last panelist, very pleased to introduce Elise Saulsberry, who is Interfaith and Outreach Associate at Sister Reach, an organization that we just love at Reproaction. And Elise is a trainer for the Reproductive Justice and Faith Tour. Elise is a mother, writer, and host of the X Factor Life podcast, a podcast that deals with issues within the LGBTQIA+ community. She enthusiastically leads Boy Talk, which is an amazing program by Sister Reach for masculine of center women, gender nonconforming folks, and trans men. As a minister of the gospel and a leader in both Pentecostal and Baptist churches, her involvement involves preaching, intercessory prayer, Bible study instructor, youth camp director, and youth and young adult ministry since age 13. Elise, we're so excited you're here. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Yes. So my first question for you is, how does gun violence touch your work as Interfaith and Outreach Associate at Sister Reach?
Well, Sister Reach is a reproductive justice organization, and there are 6 principles of reproductive justice that we advocate by. And those are that every woman and individual has the right, the human right, to decide if and when they'll have a baby and the conditions under which they'll give birth, adopt, or parent. They have the right to decide if they'll not have a baby and the options for preventing or ending a pregnancy. Another is parents. We have the right to parent the children that we already have with the necessary social support in safe environments and healthy communities, and without fear of violence from individuals or the government. Another is bodily autonomy, free from all forms of reproductive oppression. Individuals should have the right to express sexuality and spirituality without violence or shame, and have a quality of life and sustainability before and beyond the ability to give birth or to parent. And so many of those run right in hand with the work that I do as Interfaith and Outreach Associate at Sister Reach. but especially the third one, parents and children having necessary social supports in safe environments and communities, and being able to live without fear and violence. So at Sister Reach in the reproductive justice and in the reproductive justice movement, we advocate for the safety of every human being, which includes LGBT folks in the community. Gun violence also affects our work as we live in Memphis, Tennessee, a city that has consistently been on at least in the top 10 over the past couple of years. I know at least in the last decade of being one of the most dangerous cities in America, and that is due to gun violence and our murder rates, which seem to run hand in hand with cities much larger, with much larger populations than what we have here in Memphis, Tennessee. And so gun violence, even as an interfaith and outreach associate and minister, affects my family. I had a brother back in 1998 who was murdered right here in Memphis, Tennessee, and he was 22 years old at the time. And so, gun violence has never let up. The effects of him being murdered has never let up, and constantly seeing the attempt to over-police the city and not really deal with the elements that lead to gun violence. It goes directly hand in hand with the work that I do and in my personal life. According to the Commercial Appeal, our local newspaper here, they have a homicide tracker, right? And 80% of the crime in Memphis as of date this year are due to gun crimes. Just yesterday, there was a Republican commissioner in Sevier County, Warren Hurst, who, spoke against gays and the power that white men were losing in this country. And it was in a meeting where they were discussing an ordinance that would make Sevier County a gun sanctuary. And so it goes hand in hand with the work that I do at Sister Reach, as well as personally. It's very personal, being that I lost a brother due to murder and gun violence.
Incredibly, deeply sorry to hear of your loss. That's horrific.
Thank you.
If you could tell us more about Boy Talk, shifting gears. It's a revolutionary program by Sister Reach for masculine and center women, gender nonconforming folks, and trans men. And both, if you could tell us more about Boy Talk, and also, does the issue of gun violence come up in a Boy Talk program?
Okay, so Boy Talk is a program through Sister Reach, and it addresses issues within the LGBT community, but specifically for, masculine and center women and trans men of color, which includes that community includes gender nonconforming folks. And so masculine and center, or MOC, is a term that was coined by B. Cole of the Brown Boy Project, but it refers to women who identify more so with their masculine side than our feminine side, right? So in Boy Talk, we provide a safe space in person and online via our Facebook group to dialogue and learn about issues that affect our spectrum of the LGBT community. These conversations include reproductive and sexual health, homelessness, suicide, breast cancer, employment barriers, motherhood, fatherhood, otherhood, domestic violence, and gun violence. And gun violence has come up in conversations about relationships that involve domestic violence, but it has also come up because of our need to be aware in public spaces where there's a possibility that we ourselves may be harmed because of how we present, being masculine and center and transgender men and non-conforming folks. Not everybody is comfortable sometimes when we walk into the room. So we're not the initiators of attacks, but however, we do frequently experience aggression from others, mostly men who don't necessarily like that we're masculine presenting or gender nonconforming or transgender men. And unfortunately, sometimes that aggression have been met with crimes committed with gun, and a lot of those have resulted in murder of transgender males or MOC women or gender nonconforming people. And so in the group, we're having conversations about our safety and the attacks that others have experienced just for being masculine of center, or just for being gender nonconforming, or for being transgender men. You know, and again, so gun violence is often a concern, not just for transgender women, but it's just as critical for MOC, gender nonconforming folks, and transgender males. So gun violence has definitely been a conversation several times in the meetings that we host. You know, in terms of relationships and domestic violence, or like I said, in terms of us being aware of our environments that we go into, where gun violence has been perpetuated against masculine of center and gender nonconforming folks, including transgender men.
Thank you. That is very disturbing, and I thank you for discussing it with us tonight. So my last question for you is, how does interfaith organizing connect with other community organizing to address violence and oppression in our communities?
Well, any faith tenet should include believing that we're all human and should live free of violence. But at Sister Reach, we have a reproductive justice and faith curriculum that we're on tour, traveling across the country, teaching how to rethink the strategies that we've been doing involving violence and oppression. And we discussed that, as I said, with other organizations in other cities and states. We're hearing more faith language used to address oppression, even from government entities, but most times those solutions do not include protecting Black people, right? Which would be one of the most, if not the most, poverty-stricken and violence-ridden communities. So our goal is to ensure that the faith language being used by us is responsible and inclusive, and it includes safety for everyone, and responsible and inclusive, even in the language that we use, being free, you know, freeing those from spiritual oppression and spiritual violence. So interfaith organizing is not easy, because people like to believe while maintaining, they like to believe what they believe while maintaining traditional or biased faith perspectives when attempting to work together. So that presents a challenge. But for us, in terms of working with, you know, being an interfaith organization, having that interfaith curriculum, rather, we also work with other communities in terms of every year we have a Black Folks Day on the Hill. And it's an event where we and others in the community go to the state capitol and we speak face to face to our representatives about laws and bills that greatly affect our communities, our cities, and our states. So reproductive justice and faith demands that all are included and all should be safe. This includes being free from oppression, patriarchy, misogyny, racism, the very things that can escalate to gun violence. So this can only be accomplished by working in close proximity with other organizations in our city and across our state, and really across the country. And so, yeah, that's how interfaith organizations, as far as how we operate, we work with, you know, with everyone, individuals and organizations and companies where necessary.
Awesome. Thank you, Elise. And if anyone has questions for Elise, please put them in the chat box and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. So with that, I am going to encourage everyone on this call to connect with Reproaction. You can sign up for alerts at www.reproaction.org. Up in the upper right-hand corner, there is an icon to sign up for email alerts. We run these Act and Learn webinars every month. They are free of charge. If you sign up for our email list, you won't ever miss an invitation. We also will invite you to local actions in your community and keep you plugged in on all sorts of wonderful work that we're doing. You can also follow us on social media. We are Reproaction on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And our next Act and Learn webinar next month will be in November. We'll shore up the date and time and send that out to our email list, but we're really looking forward to it. We're going to talk about self-managed abortion with pills in global context. We have been running a comprehensive self-managed abortion with pills campaign for more than 2 years, traveling all over the country, spreading the word about the World Health Organization protocol for safely and effectively ending a pregnancy using abortion pills. This is work that is happening all over the world, although we're only national, and we're going to be talking to some experts in the field about that. So just make sure that you sign up for our alerts at reproaction.org, and you will get your invitation. And with that, I will pass it back to Pamela for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Erin. So if you have questions, please drop them into the question tab on your GoToWebinar control panel. At current time, we just have one question, but it's a very good one. I'm going to ask that both Elise, Jessi, and Damen answer this one. So the attendee says, my school district just enacted a policy to allow teachers to carry weapons in school. As a former board trustee, I am against this policy. Since this passed in July, I'm interested in how students should be prepared for this new initiative and what procedures should we be taking in preparation for this. So let's start with Elise. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, as a former substitute teacher here in Shelby County, that is a very dangerous policy to enact inside of a school. I think the most that I could say in this moment is just for the students and parents to fight back against that rule, because you know I've seen how stressed our teachers can be and how biased some can respond to others much harsher than they do other children, that is, whether it's high school or middle school or elementary school. And so it's sad to say, catch a teacher who is not dealing with their stress well on a bad day, and it could get very dangerous for our children. And so I would admonish parents and students to really stand up and fight back against that kind of implementation of policy, because it is a direct attack on children, you know. And I understand that it may have been implemented because of the constant times we turn on our televisions and radios and we hear about the attacks at school. But I think there's a better way than putting guns in the hands of teachers, many of whom are already at their their wits' end with their career, you know, in terms of the stress level that they have to deal with, not from the teachers and not just from someone that's coming outside of the school with guns, but from their state administrations and the responsibility that are put on their shoulders. So yeah, I would suggest that they fight back. That's at this point, if it's already been implemented, that would be the next step, you know, to start showing up at board meetings, you know, to make their voices and opinions and truths heard.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful response, Elise. Next, Jessi, would you like to respond?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things to think about with these policies where they give people guns to fight people with guns is then nobody knows who the person actually perpetuating whatever the danger is. And I think that makes things really complicated. I also think that when you're a teacher, like was mentioned, and you already have a lot of stress, it puts a lot of pressure on you to be able to act quickly and act correctly in something you shouldn't even have to be trained in. And that will probably end up putting a lot of secondary trauma on teachers, which is like the same sort of thing we see if you're like an EMT and you respond to a shooting, or a doctor and you see people after shootings. Like having to be a teacher and make that sort of decision and or actually having to carry it out is just a lot for someone. And probably means they had to go to extra training, which is probably additionally traumatizing for the teachers. If you're in that school, beyond advocacy, which I agree is super important, I would say talk about it. Talk about it with your friends. Talk about it with your kids. Talk about it with the other parents. I think it needs to be talked about. Like, a lot of these issues that cause the most problems and like the issues we don't know our kids are struggling with are the ones we aren't talking about. So as much as possible, I would just say try to bring it up and see how that's like interacting with their day-to-day or what they're thinking about in terms of that issue, and really just encourage kids to come to you when they have questions or problems, and that seems to be a place to start.
Got it. Thank you so much. Damen, as a student, I'm really curious what your thoughts are here.
Yeah, so the guns in the classroom thing. Yeah, so I first of all, I want to echo everything that's already been said. But I really think that when we see these measures being in Missouri, it happened at the state legislature, and I think we had a bill come up either this session or last session that I testified against. But I really feel like that these are really Band-Aid solutions to a wider problem. It's just, and it's really like NRA politic, really, because of, like they just want to sell 2 guns. But I mean, I've talked to teachers because obviously this question came up during 2017, 2018. This question came up, and if we're, first of all, teachers aren't paid adequately as it is in public schools, so we're tacking on another very stressful, probably time-consuming to get the adequate training, etc., job or skill, have you, to take care of this situation. And really, we're not making investments in the right places in the first place to prevent mass shootings at an actual like degree. Like I said, like the putting gun in a classroom is just a Band-Aid, and like it hasn't even been shown to like actually work, because what a lot of people forget is that there was a sheriff in Parkland that was too scared, well, too quote unquote scared to go into the school to actually do the what stops a bad guy is a good guy with a gun thing. But all I can say is you just gotta fight. I don't know how far along this policy is exactly, or what level it's at, if it's at a school board level or a state legislator level, or a city level, and I don't know what the political climate is on whatever level that is, but you really have to fight it. Like I said, I testified against a bill in the 2000, I guess it had to be the 2018 session. I like took a day off school, and we were literally there. I forget which House bill it was, but it was a House bill. It was a House committee. Literally sat on a basement floor for 8 hours and didn't testify until 9 o'clock at night on a school night, like while I was in high school. So like you really have to be invested in it, because this is it's bad. Like it's not based in any actual data that says this actually deters mass shootings. So you just have to fight it, really.
Thank you for that, Damen. So I'm going to take moderator privilege and jump on that question myself, because I have a lot of strong opinions about guns in schools and arming teachers specifically. And the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that we know that issues of bias, implicit bias, impact how people perceive somebody as threatening. There are studies that show that bias impacts the fact that some people look at adolescent Black girls and think that they're like teenagers or grown. And my first thought is that the same thing that is happening in our communities across the country, as far as being profiled and then being targeted for violence, could happen in the classroom. And as somebody who many, many, many years ago had more than 3 overtly racist teachers, the thought of them carrying a firearm terrifies me. The second thought I had when thinking about this is, as the sister of a person with a developmental disability, and when we were younger, there was a huge fight in the state of Missouri and in many communities across the country to get the right for people with various intellectual disabilities to go to public school. And that was hard fought. And one of the major concerns is that we don't create an environment in which people are threatened or may face violence or gun violence because they present in a different way in the world. So the thought that somebody who is not familiar or respectful of somebody who might vocalize differently or might not look you in the eye or might make different kinds of body movements, whatever that physical or visual difference is, shouldn't come at the cost of possibly being shot for fear. And that's a fear that I share with many people out in the world, and schools should be a safe space where people don't have to be concerned about that. There's enough worry about bullying, but being shot at should not be added to that list. So I'm not seeing any other questions. I want to thank our panelists. And she is no longer with us on this call, but I would like to thank Tishaura Jones, Treasurer of the City of St. Louis, for joining us. Dr. Jessi Gold, Assistant Professor, Department of Psychiatry at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. Damen Alexander, current and future superstar leader, March for Our Lives St. Louis in St. Louis University class of 2022. And Elise Saulsberry, thank you for joining us from Sister Reach and the Outreach and Interfaith Associate at Sister Reach. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your perspective and for joining our call. And I would also like to thank my co-director, Erin Matson, for being awesome, and encourage people, if you have not followed Reproaction, to do so on reproaction.org. Thank you, everybody, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.